Mountain boy raised by wolves. Years later, he found a cabin with his family's name. In the rugged mountains of Silverstone Ridge, where the trees whisper secrets to the wind, there stood a solitary cabin, cradled by the ever-shadowed cliffs. For nearly 20 years, no one had dared to venture near it. Whispers of its existence faded into the fabric of the mountain itself, obscured by time and isolation. It was said that the boy raised by wolves had built it. The boy who, after vanishing from the village all those years ago, was presumed dead by the villagers. But the truth was far more chilling. On the edge of a forgotten forest, where the underbrush hid the memories of those who came before, Elias Hartwell made his way through the bramble-covered paths, his heart racing, yet oddly calm. Raised by wolves, he'd learned how to survive the unforgiving wilds of the mountains. His childhood was a blur of growls, howls, and the hum of nature, his family nothing more than fur and instinct. The world beyond the trees was a strange one, a place that had rejected him, forgotten him. But not his family, not the ones he had left behind. Years of searching had led him back here, back to the cabin. Through the foggy dusk, the sight of it took him by surprise. The timber frame was still sturdy, the roof intact, though the surrounding garden was overgrown with thistles and wild grass. No one had dared tend to it for a long time. Not since the stories began, stories of a beastly child, a demon raised by animals, stories that had pushed him into the wilderness. He had survived it all. But now, in the chilling silence of his return, something tugged at his soul. It was the smell of fresh herbs that first alerted him. It was strange, so out of place in the desolation. The scent drifted through the cracked windows, mingling with the earthy aroma of the wet forest. His feet moved of their own accord toward the porch, the creaking wood underfoot, reminding him of the years spent learning to tread quietly, to stay unseen. Elias stopped just short of the door, his breath catching in his throat. The name etched into the weathered wood was unmistakable, though foreign. Hartwell! His family. His blood. But why was it here? He stood still, the world seeming to hold its breath around him, as if waiting for him to remember something he had long since forgotten. The door creaked open on its own accord, startling him, but when he peered inside, he found the cabin eerily empty. A fire still smoldered in the hearth, but there was no one to tend to it, and yet a familiar scent lingered in the air, one he hadn't smelled in years, the scent of his mother's cooking, the very same stew she used to make when he was a boy, before the world took him. His heart pounded harder, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but his legs refused to obey. The cabin was not as he remembered. It was far too familiar. A rustling in the corner of the room caught his attention. His hand instinctively went to the hunting knife he carried, but his breath caught in his throat as a figure stepped forward from the shadows. It was a woman, older than he remembered, but with the same fiery eyes, the same silver streaks in her hair. "Elias," she said, her voice soft and full of sorrow. "You've finally come back." It was his mother, or at least the woman who had once been his mother. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the worn walls of the cabin. Elias sat, staring into the flames, trying to understand what had just happened. His mother, or the woman who had once been his family, stood in the kitchen, preparing food with slow, deliberate movements. She hadn't aged a day since he had seen her last, when he was a child. She had been the one who had taught him the ways of the wolves. But now she seemed different. "Elias," she said again, her voice carrying the weight of years lost. "You don't remember, do you? The things that happened before you ran away?" He shook his head, his thoughts a tangled mess. "I remember enough," he said softly. "I remember the wolves. I remember the forest. I remember the night you left me." Her hands trembled as she placed a steaming bowl of stew before him. "It wasn't safe for you anymore," she murmured, sitting down across from him. The village, the people. They didn't understand you, Elias. They never did. You were always different, a part of something else. I thought it would be safer for you to leave. Elias narrowed his eyes, the memories of the village rushing back in vivid waves, the whispers, the fear, the accusations. You abandoned me. She looked away, guilt flashing across her face. I didn't know how else to protect you, she whispered, her voice breaking. I thought if I left they would leave you alone, but they found you anyway. They found the boy raised by wolves. They didn't know what to make of you. They still don't. The cabin grew colder as the wind howled outside, its mournful cries like the wolves that had once been his only companions. Elias reached for the bowl of stew, but stopped. Something was wrong. He could feel it in the air, like a storm was coming. Something was waiting. What happened to you? Elias asked, his voice sharp with sudden realization. Why are you here? She stared at him, her expression unreadable. It was never safe for us, Elias, never safe for the Hartwells, but you're not alone anymore. The words hung between them, thick with unspoken truths. As the wind outside howled louder, Elias understood. The wolves had been his family, but his true family, the Hartwells, were just as much a part of him. And now, after all these years, he had come home. But was it too late? The wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the old cabin's walls. Elias sat, still frozen, staring at the woman who had once been his mother. The air between them was thick with years of regret, with unspoken secrets that neither one had the courage to voice. The stew that had been placed before him remained untouched, its warmth now forgotten. "Why didn't you ever come back for me?" Elias finally asked, his voice low, a mixture of anger and hurt creeping through the edges of his words. "Why did you leave me to the wolves?" Her face softened, her eyes full of pain as she slowly stood up, her hands trembling. She moved to the fireplace, her back to him, as she stirred the embers, trying to gather her thoughts. "I thought I was protecting you," she whispered. "I thought if I left, if I gave you up, you'd be safer. The town, the people. They never understood you, Elias. You were too wild, too untamed. They would have killed you if they had the chance. I had no choice." Elias stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "No choice?" He laughed bitterly. "You could have fought for me. You could have told them the truth. But instead, you let me go, alone, in the wild, surrounded by nothing but wolves and shadows." Her shoulders shook as she finally turned to face him, her face wet with tears. "I thought if you were with the wolves, you'd be safe. I thought they'd teach you what I couldn't. I didn't know what else to do. But I never stopped thinking about you. Not a day went by where I didn't wonder what happened to my boy. The one I abandoned." Elias's heart felt like it was breaking in two. The anger he had carried for so long toward the woman who had left him was now mixed with something else, something far more painful. It was grief. Grief for the life he could have had, grief for the love he never received. He stepped forward, his gaze softening. "Why didn't you ever come back to the village?" he asked. "Why did you hide yourself away up here, away from everything?" The woman hesitated, biting her lip as if the words were caught in her throat. "I couldn't. Not after what happened. The rumors, the accusations. The town thought I was cursed, that I had something to do with Sarah's death. They blamed me for everything. The sickness, the fever, the way her body twisted up, all those marks they found." Her voice trailed off, a dark shadow crossing her face. "They thought I was a witch, Elias, and once they labeled me that, there was no turning back. I became a ghost in their eyes, and I didn't have the strength to fight them." The name Sarah struck Elias like a blow to the chest. His mind flashed back to the stories, the rumors he'd overheard as a boy. Sarah, the girl who had mysteriously died, the one whose name was whispered with fear and suspicion. The girl who had gone to the woods, who had been found sick, burning with fever after cutting her hand. The same girl whose death had led to his exile. Elias, you have to understand, she continued, her voice shaking now. I tried to help her. I tried everything I could. But it wasn't just the infection from the wound. It was something more, something no one could explain. They thought it was magic. They thought it was me. But it wasn't. It was just a curse, a shadow that followed us all. Elias's mind raced. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they made no sense. The girl, the fever, the strange marks on her body, and now, the truth of his mother's exile. Could there be more to this story than he had ever realized? You mean you didn't cause her death? Elias asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. His mother shook her head, her eyes distant. I didn't, but they wanted to believe I did. They wanted to find someone to blame, to make sense of the tragedy. And so, they turned on me. They made me the scapegoat and I couldn't fight it. It was easier to leave, to fade into the shadows. The wind outside howled louder, the trees groaning under the pressure of the storm. Elias's heart ached as he looked at the woman who had once been his mother. This was not the woman he had remembered, the one who had whispered lullabies to him under the full moon. This was someone else, someone broken by the weight of the town's accusations, by a life of isolation and regret. What really happened to Sarah? Elias asked softly, stepping closer to her. Tell me. I need to know. His mother took a deep breath, her face hardening as the storm raged outside. Sarah came to me one day, after she had been playing near the creek. She had cut her hand on something, rusty metal, an old trap, I think. I cleaned the wound, treated it, but it was already infected. There was nothing I could do to stop it. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that she had eaten something. Something from the forest. The berries, nightshade berries. They look like blueberries, but they're poisonous. And by the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. Elias's stomach churned as the truth hit him like a physical blow. He knew those berries. He knew them well. He had eaten them as a child, and even the wolves had known to avoid them. They were deadly. And now, Sarah had eaten them. So, Sarah didn't die because of the infection? Elias asked, his voice barely a whisper. No, his mother replied, her voice full of sorrow. The infection killed her, yes, but it wasn't the whole story. The berries, the poison, they hastened her death. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, she was already gone. And that's when the rumors began. The town believed I had cursed her, that I had somehow poisoned her, and they couldn't let it go. Not then. Not ever. Elias felt a cold knot in his chest. All these years he had blamed the town for forcing him into the wilderness, for making him into something he wasn't. But now, as the truth unraveled before him, he realized that he had been as much a prisoner of the town's hatred as his mother, and he had never even known it. He looked at his mother, his eyes filled with a new understanding. So, what do we do now? He asked quietly. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. Now, we have to face them, Elias. We have to go back to the village and make them see the truth. They need to know what really happened to Sarah, and they need to know that I didn't cause it. But we can't do it alone. We need each other. We always have. Elias nodded slowly, the weight of the past pressing down on him. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone. There was something in the way his mother had spoken, something that made him believe they could face the past together, and maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal. The storm outside was relentless, but Elias felt the storm inside him beginning to settle. His mother, the woman he had once thought was lost to him, had revealed the truth, the painful reality that had torn their lives apart. Yet despite the darkness of the past, something new began to stir within him. Hope. "Let's go," Elias said, his voice firm now, no longer weighed down by the ghosts of his past. "We'll face them. We'll make them see the truth." His mother nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The years of solitude had left her fragile, but Elias could see a flicker of strength in her that he hadn't seen before. She had survived the wolves, the forest, and the village's cruel judgment. Together, they could face whatever awaited them in the town. It was time to return to Pinarest. The road down the mountain was treacherous, the path slick with the rain that had fallen all day, but Elias moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his life navigating the wilderness. His mother, once hesitant, now walked beside him with a renewed purpose. The journey that had once felt like a punishment now felt like a reckoning, a chance to finally confront the people who had cast them aside. As they descended, the air grew colder, and the familiar sights of the valley began to come into view. The town of Pinarest, nestled at the foot of Silverstone Ridge, appeared as it always, small, quiet, and shrouded in secrecy. The church spire rose above the rooftops like a sentinel, watching over the town and its secrets. Elias's heart pounded as they approached the outskirts of the village. He could feel the eyes of the town upon them, even though no one was there to greet them. He had left this place as a boy, raised by wolves, feared by the people who should have been his family. And now he was returning with his mother, the woman they had all rejected, the woman they had called a witch. "They'll see us," Elias said quietly, glancing at his mother. "But they won't see the truth. Not yet." She smiled faintly. "They never did, but we have to try." The town square was eerily quiet when they arrived. It was late afternoon, and most of the villagers had likely retreated to their homes, avoiding the storm that still raged in the hills. But Elias knew the town's rhythm. He knew the people would be gathered at the general store, exchanging gossip, preparing for the upcoming harvest festival. It was time to make his presence known. As they approached the store, the door creaked open. Inside, the murmurs of conversation faltered, and every eye turned toward them. The air was thick with tension, and Elias could feel the weight of every stare. Some of the faces were familiar, people he had once known, people who had turned away from him the moment he had stepped into the wilderness. Others were strangers, the children of those who had driven him away. Elias's gaze locked onto the mayor, a stout man with a graying beard, standing at the counter. His eyes narrowed when he saw Elias, and the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. "So," the mayor said, his voice low and gruff, "the boy raised by wolves returns." Elias didn't flinch. "I'm not a boy anymore," he replied, his tone steady. "And I'm not the monster you thought I was." The room shifted as people exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers spread like wildfire. The town had been waiting for this moment, for the boy to come back, to see if the curse of the Hartwell name could ever be lifted. His mother stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. "I'm here to set things right," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "I didn't curse Sarah. I didn't kill her. I tried to save her, but no one would listen." The mayor scowled, crossing his arms over his chest. "You think you can undo all the harm you've caused, Eleanor? After all these years of hiding from the truth?" "I didn't hide from the truth," she replied, her voice growing louder with each word. "I hid from your judgment. You didn't want to hear the truth. You wanted someone to blame, and you chose me." Elias stood beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had feared, but it felt different now. His mother wasn't alone, and neither was he. "Sarah didn't die because of my mother," Elias said, his voice steady and calm. She died because of a poison no one knew about, a poison that killed her before she could get help. The room grew quiet, the weight of his words sinking in. The mayor's face twisted in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Elias looked toward his mother, who nodded in agreement. "It was nightshade," she said softly. "Berries from the creek. They look like blueberries, but they're deadly. I didn't know she had eaten them. I didn't know she was poisoned until it was too late." The mayor stepped back, his face pale as the realization began to dawn on him. "Nightshade?" he repeated, his voice faltering.
But how could you have known?
"I didn't know," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I tried. I tried everything I knew to save her. I couldn't stop the infection, but I could have stopped the poisoning if I had known." The room was still for a moment, the only sound the distant crack of thunder outside. And then slowly, one by one, the townsfolk began to speak. The words were hesitant at first, whispers of doubt and disbelief, but as the truth spread, so did the realization that they had all been wrong. They had blamed the wrong person. They had let fear dictate their actions. Elias stood tall, his mother beside him, as the townsfolk slowly turned toward them, their eyes no longer filled with fear, but with something else, something resembling understanding. Later that evening, after the storm had passed and the wind had died down, the town gathered in the square for the harvest festival. The air was thick with the scent of autumn, and the glow of lanterns flickered against the darkening sky. People moved around in small clusters, exchanging awkward but sincere apologies. Elias and his mother stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the scene unfold. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The walls that had been built between them and the town were beginning to crack. "Are you ready for this?" Elias asked his mother, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. She nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd. "I'm ready." As they made their way into the heart of the festival, Elias felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. The people who had once shunned him now watched him with wary but open eyes. They had seen the truth. They had seen the boy raised by wolves, and they had seen the man he had become. And as he reached his mother's side, he knew they were no longer just survivors. They were part of something bigger now, a family, a community, bound by blood and by truth. Festival carried on in the town square, its energy shifting from uncertain whispers to tentative acceptance. Lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting flickering shadows across the gathered crowd. Music played softly in the background, a fiddle's mournful tune rising over the hum of conversation. Yet, in the midst of it all, Elias felt a growing sense of unease. Though the townspeople had started to accept him, some still eyed him warily, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. But his mother, standing beside him, seemed at peace, for the first time in years. The awkwardness between them had melted away, and there was a new understanding between mother and son. They shared the weight of the truth now, and they could finally stand together, unburdened by lies. As they approached the community table, laden with autumn harvest offerings, a few familiar faces turned their attention to them, most with hesitant smiles, others with eyes full of lingering doubt. Martha Simmons, the woman who had once been closest to his mother, approached them first. Her face was softer now, no longer marked by the hard edges of suspicion that had once defined her. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," Martha said quietly, her voice tinged with remorse. "We should have never turned our backs on you. Eleanor raised a hand, silencing her. "It's in the past, Martha," she said gently. "We can't change it, but we can move forward." Martha nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She took a step forward, glancing at Elias with an unreadable expression. "And you, Elias," she said, her voice thick, "I never imagined you'd come back. You're nothing like the stories we told." Elias gave a small smile, his expression steady. "I never was," he replied, "but I know you're sorry, and that's enough." Martha seemed to swallow hard, wiping her eyes before turning to leave them to their quiet moment. As she moved off, several others, younger faces, approached, exchanging hesitant words of greeting. But the real test would come later. Would the town truly accept them both? Elias knew that the whispers, the fear wouldn't disappear overnight, but today felt like a beginning, a shift in the tide, if only just a little. And for the first time in many years, he didn't feel like an outsider. As they wandered through the festival, the music picking up pace, Elias noticed something that he hadn't before. People were smiling. Not forced smiles, but genuine ones. They were watching him, but not with fear or judgment. They were beginning to see him for who he truly was. "How does it feel?" his mother asked, her voice soft as she looked around at the crowd. Elias glanced at her, a small but real smile curling on his lips. "It's strange," he admitted, "but in a good way, like I'm finally coming home." Before she could reply, a shadow crossed their path. Mayor Harmon, his face still a bit stern but far less hostile than before, approached them. His eyes, once filled with suspicion, now held something else. Respect. Perhaps even a hint of guilt. "Elias," the mayor said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Your mother's right. The past. It's done. We were wrong, and I'm sorry for how we treated you both. If you're willing, we'd like to try again. Not just for your sake, but for the whole town." Elias met the mayor's gaze, seeing the weight of years of denial finally lifting from his shoulders. The apology wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "I'm willing," Elias said simply, "but we have to build something new. Together." The mayor nodded, extending his hand toward him, a silent promise to do better. Elias shook it, and in that moment, the burden of the past, the weight of all those years of misunderstanding, finally seemed to ease. The evening wore on, the town settling into a new rhythm. Children laughed and played, running between the hay bales and climbing the trees that had become their playground. The adults mingled, exchanging stories and quiet conversations that felt more genuine than before. Elias and his mother found a quiet corner near the bonfire, watching as the flames danced in the crisp night air. The warmth from the fire provided a sense of security that had been lacking in their lives for so long. Around them, the townspeople began to rebuild the relationships that had once been broken. And although the path ahead would be challenging, Elias felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in his life. "It's not perfect," his mother said, her voice thoughtful as she glanced around, "but it's a beginning." Elias nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. "A beginning," he repeated, "a real one." And for the first time in years he believed it. The journey wasn't over, the healing wasn't done, but with his mother by his side, with the town slowly starting to understand, Elias knew that they could face whatever came next together. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Elias and his mother. The town of Pinarest, though still steeped in its traditions and old wounds, had begun to shift in ways they hadn't imagined possible. The whispers, while not entirely silenced, had softened. The children who had once avoided Elias now exchanged shy glances with him at the market, some even offering tentative greetings. The adults, many of whom had been the loudest in their judgment, now seemed willing to speak with him, to offer an olive branch. Elias had never known what it felt like to belong, but now, as he walked through the village, he felt a growing sense of acceptance, as though the foundation of his new life was being laid one small brick at a time. The Harvest Festival had been the first step. The second was the plant workshop that Eleanor had agreed to hold at the town hall. She had once been the village's healer, respected for her knowledge of herbs and natural remedies. But those days had been erased by fear and suspicion. Now, Eleanor would return to the role she had abandoned, but this time with a different perspective, and with Elias by her side, eager to help her teach the younger generation about the healing arts that had once been his mother's gift. The townspeople crowded into the hall, their faces a mix of curiosity and lingering distrust. They came to learn, but some came with skepticism, still unsure of the woman they had once branded a witch. Elias stood at his mother's side, the warmth of the firelight flickering on their faces. His heart pounded as he looked around the room. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but the room was full of people willing to learn, to listen. Eleanor cleared her throat, the sound echoing in the stillness of the hall. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady and strong. "I know it's not easy to trust me after all these years, but I'm here to share what I know, not just for you, but for the future. We're all connected by the land, by the plants that grow around us, and these plants, these gifts from nature, are here to heal us, if we learn to understand them." Elias watched his mother as she spoke, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. This was the woman he had always known her to be, the woman she had been before fear had silenced her. He knew the townsfolk would still have their doubts, but he also knew that this was the first step toward mending the rift that had torn their lives apart. The workshop continued into the evening, and the people of Pinarest listened attentively as Eleanor demonstrated the healing properties of various herbs, their uses in teas, poultices, and tinctures. Elias was by her side, assisting where needed, offering his own knowledge of the plants that grew wild in the mountains. For the first time, he felt the connection between his two worlds, the world of the wild wolves that had raised him and the world of the people who had rejected him. The two worlds had always seemed so separate, but now they were beginning to weave together in a way that felt natural, like the intertwining roots of a great tree. As the night wore on, the townsfolk grew more comfortable, asking questions, exchanging stories of old remedies passed down through generations. The tension in the room began to ease, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt like she was no longer an outsider in her own home. She wasn't just the woman who had been cast out, she was the healer, the teacher, the one who had something valuable to offer. Elias glanced around the room, watching the faces of the people who had once been so cold toward him. Some still looked at him with caution, but many now regarded him with curiosity and even respect. His heart swelled with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the town that was healing. It was him, too. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic in Pinarest continued to shift. The townspeople slowly began to embrace the knowledge that Eleanor and Elias shared. The younger generation, in particular, were eager to learn about the plants that had once been so important to the village's survival. They came to the cabin to gather herbs with Elias, and slowly but surely, the harsh lines that had separated them were fading. But not everyone was ready to let go of the past. One evening, as Elias and his mother walked back from the market, they were approached by Elder Thomas, the town's self-appointed historian and the man who had most vehemently opposed their return. He stood at the edge of the road, his hands clasped behind his back, his face set in a grim expression. "Evening," Elias said, his voice cautious but not hostile. "Evening," Elder Thomas replied, his gaze flicking to Eleanor before settling back on Elias. "You've been doing good work with the plants, teaching the children, sharing what you know." Elias raised an eyebrow, surprised by the unexpected compliment.
Thank you. I've been thinking, Thomas continued, his voice low.
"You're trying to fix what was broken, and I respect that. But you're not the only ones who've been hurt. The town, too, has scars, and some of those scars can't be healed overnight." Elias felt the weight of the man's words, but he didn't flinch. "We're not trying to erase the past," he said evenly. "We're just trying to move forward." Elder Thomas nodded, his face softening slightly. I know, but there's more to healing than just planting herbs and teaching children. Sometimes the past has to be acknowledged, fully. It's not just about forgiving. It's about understanding what happened, why it happened, and accepting that sometimes there are things you can't change. Elias looked at his mother, who was silent beside him. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully. Thomas's gaze turned distant, as if he were looking back through time. "I mean, the whole town has to face the truth, not just about you and your mother, but about Sarah, about the nightshade, about how we all failed her. The town's fear and its need to blame someone, those things can't just be swept away." Elias absorbed the weight of his words, understanding that this was the beginning of something deeper than he had anticipated. The town was finally ready to confront its own fears, to face the truth they had buried for so long. "It's not going to be easy," Elias said quietly, looking at Elder Thomas. "But maybe it's time." The old man nodded, his expression resigned but hopeful. "Maybe it is." A few days later, a town meeting was called. The gathering was held at the town hall, and this time the seats were filled, not just with the usual crowd of townsfolk, but with those who had long been absent, those who had turned away from the Hartwells all those years ago. There was tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to settle in the bones of everyone present. But there was something else too, a sense of readiness. The time for whispers and secrets had passed. Now it was time for the truth. Elias stood at the front with his mother, Elder Thomas beside them. The room was silent, all eyes fixed on the small group. Mayor Harmon stood from his seat and cleared his throat. "We're here to put things right," he said, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of years of regret. "To face the past, and to finally lay it to rest." The room was thick with anticipation as Mayor Harmon's voice echoed in the quiet hall. The townsfolk, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity, sat in a semicircle, waiting. It wasn't just another town meeting. This time, it felt different. A moment of reckoning, where the ghosts of the past were to be confronted head-on. Elias stood next to his mother, her hand steady on his arm, a silent testament to the years of strength and survival she had endured. The town's eyes were on them, but for the first time, the weight of judgment didn't feel suffocating. There was a new air of respect in the room, one that Elias hadn't dared to hope for. Elder Thomas cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the silence. "We all know why we're here. This town, for too long, has carried a heavy burden of secrets. It's time to talk about Sarah Miller. It's time to face the truth." There was a collective shift in the room. Some turned their eyes towards Sarah's parents, sitting quietly at the back. Her mother, pale and fragile, clutched a handkerchief in her lap, her face an unreadable mask. Her father sat next to her, his jaw clenched, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Their grief, though still raw, seemed to be waiting for something. "The night Sarah died," Elder Thomas continued, "was the start of something that this town has never recovered from. We failed her. We failed Eleanor. And we failed ourselves. All these years we've carried that failure without knowing the full truth." Elias could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His eyes flicked to his mother, whose face remained calm, but he could sense the deep sorrow beneath her composure. They hadn't been given the chance to mourn Sarah as a town. Instead, they had been blamed, ostracized, forgotten. "I have been researching," Thomas went on, "and there are things we never knew about that night, things that should have been known. Eleanor wasn't the one who poisoned Sarah. She wasn't the cause of her death. It was the berries from the creek, the nightshade. Poisonous berries that no one knew to look for." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The room was silent, save for the occasional shuffle of uncomfortable movement. The weight of the truth seemed to hit harder now that it was being spoken aloud. "It wasn't the infection," Thomas continued, looking around the room, his gaze meeting several eyes. It was the nightshade, and we all believed the worst. We didn't listen. We didn't understand. We turned our backs on Eleanor when she was the only one trying to save Sarah. Eleanor's hand tightened on Elias's arm, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The truth had been spoken, and it was a truth that no one in the room could deny. The mayor, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward. His voice was softer now, more vulnerable. "We were wrong. We failed you, Eleanor. We failed your son. And we failed Sarah." His eyes moved towards Sarah's parents, who remained silent. "It's time for this town to heal." Elias looked toward the back of the room where Sarah's parents sat. He had expected anger, but all he saw was exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that only comes from carrying grief for too long. Sarah's father slowly stood, his face etched with years of pain. "I always believed it was Eleanor's fault," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I blamed her for my daughter's death, for the way she suffered. But I was wrong. I see that now, and I'm sorry." There was a long, painful silence. The words were slow to come, but they were the right words. The apology had been long overdue. Sarah's mother didn't speak, but her tears spoke volumes. Elias's heart tightened, and he saw his mother's shoulders sag as the years of grief and bitterness slowly started to lift. The wounds were deep, and while the words weren't enough to heal them completely, they were the beginning of something that could lead to understanding, forgiveness. Sarah's father turned toward the crowd. "We have to stop hiding behind the lies. This town has suffered long enough. We need to move forward, for Sarah, for Eleanor, for all of us." The room fell into a deep silence. The truth had been laid bare, and it was both freeing and painful. The weight of years of suspicion and guilt could no longer be ignored, but it was a burden that had been lifted, and for the first time in many years, Elias felt a flicker of something close to hope. Elder Thomas looked at the mayor, who nodded. The town meeting had become a turning point, but the real work was yet to be done. There would be no quick resolution, no simple way to erase the past. But for the first time, the people of Pinarest had taken the first step. They had acknowledged the truth. Elias looked at his mother, and for a moment, he could see a flicker of the woman she had once been. The healer, the mother, the woman who had been lost to fear and exile, but who now stood at the center of the town's reckoning. "I've spent my life running from this place," Elias said, his voice carrying across the room. "But I'm not running anymore. I'm here. I'm here because this is where I belong, and we can't change the past, but we can change the future, together." The crowd was silent, but this time there was no resistance. There was only the quiet acknowledgement of a truth that could no longer be denied. The truth of what had happened to Sarah, the truth of what had happened to his mother, and the truth of what had happened to him. Then the questions of the meeting slowly disbanded, the townspeople leaving in small groups, their conversations quieter, more reflective. The healing had begun, but it wasn't going to be easy. There would be more difficult conversations, more apologies to make, more misunderstandings to overcome. But for the first time in years, the future didn't seem so bleak. Elias and his mother remained behind, standing at the front of the hall, their eyes meeting in a moment of understanding. They had both been broken by the past, but now they had a chance to heal. Together. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They weren't alone anymore. The days following the town meeting were quieter, but the ripple effects of the truth began to settle into the bones of Pinarest. There was a noticeable change in the air, an undercurrent of curiosity, mixed with a willingness to rebuild. The town had taken the first steps toward reconciliation, but there was still much work to do. Elias and his mother Eleanor had taken to spending more time in the town square. Though their presence was still met with wary glances from some, There was an openness that hadn't been there before. The children, who had once avoided him like a curse, now stopped him in the street, asking questions about the mountain and the animals he had grown up with. The adults, too, had softened, often pausing to greet them with small, hesitant nods. But it was Sarah's parents who had been the most difficult to face. Though her father had offered his apology at the meeting, the weight of his grief still hung heavy. He hadn't fully forgiven himself for the years of blame he had placed on Eleanor, and Elias knew that it would take more than words to truly heal that wound. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the hills, Elias and Eleanor made their way to the cemetery. It was a quiet walk, and though neither of them spoke, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They both knew where they were going. At the cemetery gates, they stopped, taking in the weathered gravestones. Most were old, their names faded by time, but there was one grave that still stood out, a fresh bouquet of flowers resting beside it. Eleanor stepped forward, her breath catching as she approached the grave. The stone was simple, engraved with the name Sarah Miller in delicate lettering. Elias stood back, giving her space. "I didn't kill her," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't save her, but I tried." Elias watched his mother, her hand trembling as she laid a single wildflower on the grave. He knew the weight of those words. For years, she had carried the guilt of Sarah's death, even though she had been innocent. But now, as she stood here, facing the past head-on, he could see the release in her posture. She was letting go of the burden she had carried for so long. After a long moment, Eleanor turned to him, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. "I never wanted you to carry my pain, Elias. I never wanted you to be burdened by the lies they told. But now I can finally breathe. Now we can finally move forward." Elias nodded, his chest tightening with the weight of the moment. For so long he had felt the sting of abandonment, the isolation of being an outsider. But standing here, beside his mother, he felt a sense of belonging that he had never known. The town might have cast them out, but they were still standing, still fighting for the truth. "Let's go home," Elias said, his voice soft but steady. "There's still work to be done." The following weeks were a flurry of activity in Pinarest. The town was changing, slowly but surely. The people who had once feared Eleanor now sought her out for advice, asking for her herbal remedies, seeking her guidance on everything from gardening to health. Elias, too, became a fixture in the town, not just as the boy raised by wolves, but as a part of the community. He helped where he could, whether it was mending fences, teaching children about the plants that grew in the wild, or simply sitting with the elders in the evening, listening to their stories. But it was at the next harvest festival that the true test would come. The town had made strides toward healing, but there was still one question that loomed large. Would they accept them completely? Would they truly embrace the Hartwells as part of the fabric of Pinarest? Or would they remain the outsiders, forever marked by the past? Elias stood at the edge of the festival grounds, watching as the town square came to life with color and movement. The tables were laden with food, the air filled with the sound of laughter and music. Children ran between the hay bales, their faces lit with excitement, and in the center of it all, Eleanor stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. "This is it," she said, her voice quiet but filled with determination. "We're here. We've earned our place." Elias looked around, the faces of the townsfolk now familiar, no longer filled with suspicion, but with a tentative warmth. He could feel the shift in the air. This was their moment. The past, while still lingering in the shadows, no longer defined them. They were moving forward, and there was nothing left to fear. The mayor, who had taken on a more neutral stance in recent weeks, stepped forward, holding a microphone in one hand. The crowd quieted as he raised his other hand in a gesture of welcome. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying over the festival grounds. "It's time to celebrate the harvest, to give thanks for all that we've worked for, and to welcome those who have helped shape our town into what it is today." Elias's heart raced as the mayor turned toward him and Eleanor, his voice softening. "Elias Hartwell," the mayor said, his tone sincere, "and Eleanor Hartwell, you've both shown us the true meaning of resilience. You've taught us that healing is not just about the plants we grow or the medicine we prepare,
but about the connections we make with each other.
We've learned that the past, though painful, can't define our future." A ripple of applause spread through the crowd, and for the first time, Elias felt the weight of the town's acceptance. It wasn't perfect, and there would still be obstacles to face, but in that moment, he knew that they had crossed a threshold. The journey of healing had begun, and it wasn't just about his family. It was about the town as a whole. As the music picked up again and the first of the harvest dances began, Elias took his mother's hand and led her toward the center of the square. The people of Pinarest, hesitant at first, now parted to make way for them, their faces bright with smiles. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one where the ghosts of the past no longer haunted them but had been put to rest. Elias and Eleanor danced under the starry sky, the light from the bonfire flickering in their eyes, the warmth of the town's embrace wrapping around them. And for the first time in their lives, they weren't just survivors, they were home. The weeks after the harvest festival passed like a dream, one that Elias could hardly believe was real. The town of Pinarest, once a place of fear and judgment, had transformed into a place of healing. The shadows of the past that had hung over Eleanor and Elias like a storm cloud had finally dissipated. The townspeople, who had once whispered behind their backs, now greeted them with smiles and invitations. Life had returned to the town square, and it seemed as though for the first time in years, Pinarest was thriving. Elias and his mother had settled into their roles. Eleanor, the healer once again, now sought out for her wisdom and her remedies. Elias, ever the curious boy, had become the town's unofficial guide to the wilderness. The children of Pinarest often followed him into the mountains, learning about the plants that grew wild, the animals that roamed,
And the secrets of the land.
that had once been a world unto itself. But even in this new, more harmonious life, there was still a quiet undertow of unrest. It wasn't the whispers of suspicion any longer, but something else, a creeping sense of change. And while most of the town had embraced Eleanor and Elias, some old wounds had not yet healed. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Elias and his mother sat together on the porch of their cabin, the soft murmur of the forest surrounding them. There was a peacefulness in the air that Elias had never known, a quiet contentment that filled his chest with warmth. "You've done well," Eleanor said, her voice calm yet filled with pride as she looked at her son. "I never thought I'd see this day, never thought I'd be welcomed back, and you've built something here." Elias smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "It wasn't just me, Mom," he replied. "It was us. You're part of this too. They see you now. They know who you really are." Eleanor's gaze softened, her fingers brushing the edge of her garden journal that she always kept with her. "I never wanted to be a hero," she said quietly. "I never wanted to be the one they turned to. But I've learned that sometimes life has other plans for us." Elias was silent for a moment, his thoughts drifting. Though the town had accepted them, a part of him still felt like an outsider. The old isolation he had carried within him since he was a child had not completely vanished. It was as though the mountains still called to him, still pulled at the deepest parts of his soul, as though reminding him of the boy he had been, raised by wolves, untamed, wild. But he also knew that he could never go back. Pinarest, for all its flaws, had become his home. He had come to understand the balance between the world of the forest and the world of the village. His two worlds could coexist, just as he and his mother had. Eleanor watched him, sensing the conflict within him. "You still feel it, don't you?" she asked gently. Elias nodded. "The wildness. It's still there, Mom. I think it always will be." She gave him a knowing smile. "It's part of you, Elias. It always has been, but you've learned to live in both worlds now. You're not bound by one or the other. You can choose when to let the wilderness in and when to stay grounded here. You can have both." Her words comforted him, and for the first time in weeks, Elias felt the weight of his two worlds settle comfortably on his shoulders. He had been torn between them for so long, uncertain of where he truly belonged. But maybe, just maybe, he belonged in both. The town meeting was called the following week. The harvest was over, the days growing shorter, and there were matters to discuss. The weather had been unusually warm for late autumn, and the townspeople had begun to talk about the coming winter. The roads would need to be cleared, food supplies stocked, and preparations made for the long months ahead. But there was something else, something unspoken that hovered in the air. Elias sat with his mother at the back of the room, watching as the familiar faces of the town's elders and leaders spoke one after another. The mayor, as usual, was at the forefront, his voice steady as he addressed the townspeople about the upcoming season. But today, his words carried a different tone, one of unity, of moving forward as a community, not as a collection of individuals clinging to their past. It was when the conversation turned to the future of the town that Elias knew something was coming. The mayor paused, his gaze scanning the room before landing on Eleanor and Elias. "I think," Mayor Harmon said, his voice slightly hesitant, "it's time we officially recognize the Hartwells for what they've brought to this town. The healing, the knowledge,
The connection to the land that we've all neglected for too long."
Elias and Eleanor exchanged a quiet glance. It wasn't a surprise, but hearing it spoken aloud was different. This was it, the final step in their journey, the one that would define their future here in Pinarest. "We've come a long way," the mayor continued, "and it's only right that we take steps to ensure that the gifts the Hartwells bring are not just accepted, but celebrated. It's time to make them an official part of this community. We can't ignore the truth any longer." The room buzzed with murmurs, and Elias felt a strange sense of pride swelling within him. The people of Pinarest, though slow to accept them, had finally come to understand the value of what they offered. The distrust, the whispers, all of it was fading away, replaced with something new, something far more powerful: respect. The mayor turned to Eleanor and Elias, his expression one of sincerity. "What do you say? Will you accept our invitation to truly join us, to become a formal part of this town?" Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Elias's, and for the first time in a long while, she seemed to soften with a kind of quiet joy. "We've been accepted in many ways already," she said, her voice steady but warm. "But yes, I think it's time." Elias nodded. "It's time." The room erupted into applause, but Elias didn't hear the clapping. He only heard the steady beat of his own heart, strong and steady. He had finally found his place. They both had. The truth had brought them back, but now it was love, respect, and understanding that would carry them forward. The town square was once again filled with people, but this time it was different. The light of the bonfire seemed to shine a little brighter, the laughter a little louder, and the music a little livelier. It wasn't just the harvest they were celebrating their future, together. Elias stood beside his mother, watching the people of Pinarest dance around the fire, their faces lit by the glow. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like an outsider. He was part of something bigger than himself, something that was born out of understanding and compassion. And as the fire crackled and the stars glittered above them, Elias knew that they had found their place. Finally, winter in Pinarest came quickly, the first snow falling gently in the early hours of the morning, dusting the rooftops and turning the town square into a quiet, frosty wonderland. The air was sharp and crisp, the mountains beyond the town standing tall against the pale blue sky. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled steadily, and the warmth of the hearth felt like the heart of the home. Eleanor, her hands steady despite the years of solitude, prepared a batch of healing salves by the fire, the herbs drying in the corners of the room, their familiar scent comforting. Elias watched his mother, his mind drifting back to the moment when they had first arrived in Pinarest. How they had been greeted with suspicion, with fear. How his own heart had once longed for the wild, the freedom of the mountains. But now, as he sat in this cabin with his mother, surrounded by the soft light of the fire, he couldn't imagine a life without this new beginning. It was early morning, and the town had begun to settle into the rhythms of winter. The roads had been cleared, and the market was bustling with activity, even if the cold air kept most people inside. There was a sense of peace now, a sense of belonging that Elias had never known. "You're thinking again," Eleanor said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. She looked up from her work, a small smile tugging at her lips. Elias smiled back, though there was a faint trace of uncertainty in his eyes. "Just wondering if this is really it, you know?" Eleanor's smile softened, and she set aside her work, moving to sit beside him.
What do you mean?
"Well, I've been here for a while now," Elias said, his voice thoughtful. "And everything's different. People don't look at us the same way. They don't whisper behind our backs anymore. But it's still new. I don't want to wake up one day and realize I'm still that boy from the mountains, that I haven't really changed at all." Eleanor regarded him carefully, her eyes filled with understanding. "You're not that boy anymore, Elias, and you never were. The mountain raised you, yes. It taught you how to survive, but it also made you strong. And now, you're here, with me, and you're becoming someone who can stand in two worlds, not one, not the other. Both." Elias looked at his mother, her words sinking into him like the warmth from the fire. "But what if I'm still caught between them?" he asked quietly. "What if the wild part of me is still out there, calling to me?" Eleanor's smile was gentle but sure. "Then you'll listen to it. But you'll also choose when to come back, when to be part of this world. You've always been both, Elias, and that's your strength. You have the freedom to choose." Elias nodded, the weight of her words settling into his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt the pull of both worlds, not as a burden, but as something he could balance. He was no longer an outsider in either world. He was part of both. The days grew colder and the nights longer, but the sense of peace that had settled over Pinarest remained. Elias spent his mornings working with his mother, learning more about the plants and herbs she had once used to heal the people of the town. The townsfolk, who had once feared her, now sought her guidance on everything from illnesses to remedies for the winter chill. They came to her cabin for warmth, both literal and figurative, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt the weight of the town's embrace. But it was the children who brought the most joy. They had once been told to stay away from her, to avoid the witch on the mountain, but now they came with questions and curiosity, their eyes wide with wonder as they learned about the forest, the plants, and the animals that Elias had once roamed with. He became the town's unofficial guide, showing the children how to track animals, how to identify plants, how to survive in the wilderness without losing touch with the world they lived in. Eleanor watched as Elias worked with the children, her heart swelling with pride. She had always known he was capable of great things, but seeing him connect with the children of Pinarest, seeing them respect him, made her realize just how far they had come. It was on one particularly cold evening, as the wind howled outside and the snow piled up against the cabin's walls, that the final piece of their journey came together. The town had planned a winter celebration, the first of its kind since Eleanor's return. It would be a night of food, music, and storytelling, a way for the town to come together and celebrate what they had overcome. Elias and Eleanor stood in the town square, the smell of roasting meats and freshly baked pies filling the air. The warmth of the fire pits seemed to push back the cold, and the laughter of the townspeople was a welcome sound. For once, there was no tension, no lingering fear. There was only the sound of the wind in the trees, the music, and the joy of the community that had come together. As the evening progressed, Elias found himself standing at the edge of the crowd, watching as the people danced and sang. He could feel the pull of the wilderness, the call of the mountains, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was a gentle tug, a reminder that he was free to choose. "Are you all right?" Eleanor asked, coming to stand beside him. Elias looked at her, his smile warm. "I think I finally found my place, Mom." Eleanor smiled back, her heart full. "I think you have too." The music swirled around them, the firelight flickering in their eyes, and for the first time in a long while, Elias felt complete. The mountains were still a part of him, but so was this place. He had found his home, not just in the cabin, not just in the town, but in the delicate balance between them both. He was no longer lost, no longer caught between two worlds. He was living in both, and that was enough. As the night drew to a close, the townspeople gathered around the bonfire for one last song, their voices rising together in unison. Elias and Eleanor stood together, side by side, watching the flames dance in the cold night air. They had come a long way from the days of fear and exile, and now they were home. The first real snowstorm of winter had hit Pinarest, blanketing the town in a deep, soft silence that only snow could bring. The storm had rolled in swiftly, the wind howling down from the peaks as if nature itself were reminding the town of its raw, untamable beauty. Elias stood at the cabin window, watching the snowflakes swirl in the dim light of dusk. The world outside had turned white, everything muffled, soft. The trees bent under the weight of the snow, their branches heavy but strong. Eleanor sat at the table, her hands moving gracefully as she worked on a batch of her signature healing salves. The scent of lavender and rosemary filled the room, mingling with the wood smoke from the hearth. She had become a fixture in the community, sought after for her wisdom, her knowledge, and it wasn't just the people of Pinarest who had come to appreciate her. Elias could feel the change, a shift in the town that had welcomed them both, imperfect and scarred as they were. They had found peace, but Elias knew that peace was a fragile thing. He turned away from the window and walked over to the table where his mother worked. Her face was serene, but there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She had given so much to the town, and though it had healed many, there were still shadows that lingered in the corners of her heart. "Mom," Elias said, his voice soft, "you all right?" Eleanor looked up, her expression gentle but tired. "I'm fine," she said, though Elias could tell she wasn't. She had been working non-stop, preparing remedies, speaking with the townspeople, offering help where it was needed. She had become the backbone of Pinarest, but even the strongest trees could be bent by the wind. Elias reached out, placing his hand over hers. "You've done enough," he said quietly. "You don't have to carry everything by yourself anymore." Eleanor smiled, her fingers briefly squeezing his. "I know. I just want to make sure that I don't forget what it means to truly help. I can't lose sight of that, Elias. Not after everything." Elias nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He knew she had always carried the responsibility of healing the town, of redeeming herself in their eyes. But as much as the town had changed, as much as they had all come to understand the truth, the past still clung to them in ways that were hard to let go of. Maybe it's time to take a break, Elias suggested. Maybe we should go for a walk in the woods tomorrow, just the two of us. Eleanor considered his words, her eyes thoughtful. She had spent so much time pouring herself into the town that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply exist outside of it, to feel the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, the freedom of the wild. She smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "I think that sounds like a good idea," she said. "We haven't done that in a long time, have we?" Elias shook his head, his eyes lighting up. "It's been too long. And the mountains, they've always been home. You're right. We can't forget that part of us." The storm passed by morning, leaving the town buried under a thick blanket of snow. The world outside was still and beautiful,
The kind of silence that only winter could bring.
Elias and Eleanor bundled up in layers of warm clothing, the crisp air biting as they made their way out of the cabin. The town, though covered in snow, had already begun to stir. The sound of shovels scraping against the ground and the chatter of neighbors echoed through the quiet. But Elias and his mother didn't linger in the town's square. They headed toward the forest, their steps crunching in the fresh snow. As they walked, the weight of the world seemed to lighten, and for the first time in weeks, Elias felt his chest unclench. The wild, untamed beauty of the mountains had always been a part of him, a part of both him and his mother, a connection that had never truly been severed, even during the darkest years. They walked in silence, the world around them still, save for the occasional bird call or the rustling of snow-laden branches. The snow-covered ground was smooth and unbroken, a vast canvas waiting to be explored. They walked deeper into the forest, the path narrow but familiar. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, grounding them both in the moment. It was as if the mountains were whispering to them, reminding them that no matter how far they had come, they were still part of something greater. Elias glanced at his mother, her face soft in the muted light of the winter afternoon. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly, "the way things used to be? When we were out there, just the two of us?" Eleanor stopped walking, her gaze drifting over the snow-covered landscape. She thought for a moment before answering. "I miss the simplicity of it," she said, "the way the world felt small, just the two of us against the wilderness. But I don't miss the isolation. We've built something here, Elias, something that matters, and I don't think I could go back to the way things were. Not now. Not after all we've been through." Elias nodded, understanding more than he had in the past. The mountains, the wolves, they had shaped him, but they had also held him back. Pinarest had given him something he hadn't known he needed, a sense of community, a sense of belonging. The mountains would always call to him, but he knew that the path he had chosen was here, with his mother, in this town that had finally embraced them. They continued walking, the sound of their boots in the snow filling the quiet of the forest. They came to a clearing, a place they had visited often when Elias was younger. It was here, in this peaceful spot, that they had shared some of their quietest moments. The tall pines stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, the world around them still and perfect. Eleanor crouched down, brushing the snow from a nearby rock. "This place, it's always felt like home," she said softly. Elias knelt beside her, his fingers tracing the outline of the stone. "It still does," he said, looking up at the trees, at the sky above them. The world seemed to stretch on forever, and in that moment, Elias realized that he wasn't just part of this place, he was part of something bigger, something that couldn't be defined by the past, by the fear, by the isolation. He was part of the land, part of the town, and part of the people who had slowly but surely welcomed him and his mother home. That evening, as they returned to the cabin, Elias and Eleanor found themselves once again sitting by the fire, the warmth of the flames casting long shadows on the walls. The storm had passed, the snow had settled, and the world outside was still. Elias looked at his mother, her face serene in the glow of the firelight. "I think I'm ready for whatever comes next," he said quietly. "I think we both are." Eleanor smiled, her hand resting on his. "We've always been ready, Elias. It's just that now we finally know where we belong." And as the fire crackled in the hearth, the world outside settled into a peaceful stillness.
And Elias knew that no matter what the future held,
They would face it together. Spring had come to Pinarest like a whispered promise, soft and steady. The snow had melted away, leaving behind fresh, green shoots pushing through the still cold earth. The town had begun to stir again, but the cold breath of winter still lingered in the air, a reminder of the months they had spent locked away in the heavy embrace of winter's chill. Ilias stood at the edge of the forest, his gaze drifting to the mountains that had once felt so distant, so unreachable. The world had changed since the snowstorm, the town, his relationship with Eleanor, his own sense of self. They had all evolved, shedding the past in pieces, bit by bit. But the mountains, those ancient giants that had shaped his life, still called to him. The town had finally accepted him. The whispers had stopped, the side glances had faded. He had been embraced, not as a wild boy raised by wolves, but as a part of Pinarest, an integral piece of a puzzle that had finally come together. And yet, even with all the comfort and belonging he now felt, there was still a part of him that could never fully be part of the world in town. The wilderness would always be there, pulling him back, and as he stood there, his boots pressing into the soft earth, he wondered if he was truly ready to leave the wild behind. Eleanor had been quiet lately, too. She had grown into her role in the town, as a healer, as a guide, as a mother. But the storms of the past still lingered in her eyes, and Elias could see that the old weight was never truly gone. She had learned to forgive the town, to forgive herself, but the past had a way of marking a person. And there were days when it was clear that Eleanor felt like a ghost in the place she had once called home. Ilias had come to understand this about his mother, her strength, her compassion, but also her need for solitude. She had given so much of herself to the people of Pinarest,
and though they had embraced her,
Elias knew she longed for the peace of the mountains, for the quiet solitude of the wild. It was a part of her, just as it was a part of him. And it was this silent bond that connected them, even when words failed. On a brisk morning in early spring, Elias and his mother set out for the forest, their footsteps quiet in the soft earth. The trees were just beginning to bud, the air filled with the promise of growth. For once, the weight of the world felt far away, and as they walked side by side, Elias couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. "Mom," he said quietly, breaking the silence, "do you ever miss it? The wild?" Eleanor's voice was steady, but there was an undeniable softness to it. "I miss it every day," she said. "I miss the freedom, the simplicity of it all. But I also know that I can't go back. Not now. The town needs me. You need me." Elias glanced at her, his heart heavy with understanding. "But you don't need to give up everything," he said. "You're not bound to them, Mum. You're free." Eleanor smiled, her eyes soft. "Maybe, but there's something else I've come to realize. The wild has always been my refuge, but it's not enough anymore. I've learned that there's more to life than solitude, more than just surviving. I think I found a home here. With you, in Pinarest." Elias was silent, the weight of her words sinking deep into his chest. For years, he had carried the burden of their isolation, the sense of being an outsider, even when they had been among the people. But now, he understood. Home wasn't just a place, it was a feeling. And Pinarest, with all its imperfections, had become home. They reached the edge of the clearing where the old cabin stood, its weathered frame now nearly hidden by the growth of new trees. The place where they had once built their lives from the ground up, where they had fought to survive and heal. Now, it was a symbol of their strength, their resilience, and their ability to adapt. Elias paused, looking back at his mother. "Do you think we've found it?" he asked. "A new beginning?" Eleanor nodded, her gaze steady. "I do. We've come a long way, Elias, and this is only the beginning." The town, too, had begun to change. The people of Pinrest had started to see the world through different eyes, their once closed hearts opening to the possibilities that Eleanor and Elias represented. The Winter Festival, once a symbol of division, had become a celebration of unity, a moment for the community to gather and embrace what they had built together. And as the town prepared for the next season, there was a renewed sense of optimism in the air. Yet, there was still work to be done. The old wounds hadn't fully healed, and there were still many who looked at Elias with skepticism. But the difference was that now, the whispers were fading, replaced by conversations of respect and curiosity. And in that respect, Elias had found his place. No longer the boy raised by wolves, no longer the outsider. He was a part of the town, a part of something bigger. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the sky turned purple with the fading light, Elias stood at the edge of the square, watching the people celebrate. He could hear the music, the laughter, and the warmth of the community, and as he stood there, he realized something. He wasn't just part of Pinrest now. He was part of the world. The wilderness would always be his, but it was no longer the only thing that defined him. And in the stillness of the night, under the soft glow of the lanterns, Elias felt the future stretching out before him. It was uncertain, yes, but it was also full of possibility. The town had accepted him, and he had accepted it in return. There was still more to learn, more to discover, and he was ready for it. With his mother by his side and the town behind him, Elias took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past settle into place, and for the first time in his life, he felt at peace. The days after the spring thaw brought an energy to Pinrest that couldn't be contained. The town had been reborn, much like the plants and trees that had begun to sprout from the fertile earth. It was a quiet revolution, one that started with trust and healing, and it grew in small moments, an invitation to tea, a neighbor stopping by to share a new recipe, children playing together where there had once been fear. Pinrest was no longer just a town, it was a family, one that had rebuilt itself from the ground up. Elias stood at the edge of the forest once more, looking out at the wilds he had grown up in. The mountains, vast and untamed, called to him as they always had. He felt the familiar pull, the longing for the quiet, the solitude, but something had shifted. For the first time, he didn't feel torn between two worlds. The mountains were still a part of him, but so was the town, and that in itself was a revelation. The wolves had raised him, but it was Pinrest that had shaped him into the person he was becoming. He had come to understand that the wild didn't have to be an escape, but a piece of who he was, a piece he could carry with him. He had learned to balance the untamed part of himself with the grounded, connected part he was now discovering through the community. It was a bright, clear morning when Elias decided it was time. He walked through the streets of Pinrest, his boots kicking up the fresh spring earth, the scent of pine and wildflowers thick in the air. He made his way toward the town square, where preparations for the next festival were already underway. The energy of the people was palpable, their excitement for the coming event building with every passing hour. Eleanor was there, her hands busy with the delicate work of arranging herbs and flowers for the market booth. Her face was lit with the soft glow of contentment. The lines of worry that had once creased her brow now smoothed by the warmth of her community. She had found her peace in Pinrest, just as he had. Elias stopped beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. "How's the booth coming along?" he asked, a teasing smile tugging at his lips. Eleanor glanced up and smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "We're getting there," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You know, the town has been more supportive than I ever thought possible. It's not just the remedies anymore. They want to know the plants, how they grow, how they heal. It feels like a part of me is finally being seen for what it is." Elias watched his mother, the pride swelling in his chest. "You've earned it, Mum. All of it. This is your home now." Eleanor's smile softened, her eyes meeting his. "And it's your home too, Elias. You've always been a part of this, whether you knew it or not." Elias nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in his heart. He had spent so long searching for something, anything to call his own. The wild had always been his refuge, his place of solace. But Pinarest was where he had found the balance. It was where he belonged. The festival arrived with all the vibrancy Elias had come to expect from the town. The square was filled with music, laughter, and the delicious smells of food and drink. There were games for the children, stalls selling crafts and herbs, and the sweet sound of fiddles that seemed to carry the spirit of the town itself. It was a celebration, not just of the harvest, but of everything the town had overcome. Elias stood at the edge of the square, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. It was overwhelming at first, the energy of so many people gathered together, but as he watched the smiles and the ease of their movements, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had found his place here, not just as a boy raised by wolves, but as a part of something bigger.
Everything looks beautiful.
He said to Eleanor, who stood beside him, her face glowing with pride. "It does, doesn't it?" she replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I'm glad you're here to see it." Elias turned to her, his expression serious for a moment. "I'm glad I'm here too, Mum. For all of it. For you, for Pinarest, for me." Eleanor's smile softened, her eyes reflecting a quiet pride. "You've come a long way, Elias, from the boy who wandered the mountains to the man standing here today." Elias shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. "I'm still just a boy, Mum. I think I always will be." Eleanor laughed softly, her eyes crinkling at the edges. "You've always been more than that, but yes, there's always a bit of the wild boy in you, isn't there?" Elias looked out at the town, the sound of music and laughter filling the air. "Yeah," he said softly, "but now I can carry both parts of me, the wild and this." Eleanor placed her hand on his shoulder, squeezing it gently. "I think that's exactly how it was meant to be." As the sun set over the mountains, casting a golden glow over Pinarest, Elias and Eleanor found themselves standing together, watching the town celebrate. The firelight flickered in the distance, the warmth from the bonfire reaching them even from afar. The music played late into the evening, the sounds of laughter and joy carrying through the cool night air. For the first time in years, Elias felt the pull of the wild and the embrace of the town, not as separate forces, but as one. He had always believed that he had to choose between them, that one had to dominate the other. But now, he realized that he didn't have to choose. He could belong to both, and in doing so, he had found a home, not just in Pinarest, but within himself. Eleanor stood beside him, her face illuminated by the soft light of the fire. "I think," she said, her voice soft, "that this is where we were always meant to be." Elias nodded, his heart full as he looked out at the people, his people, celebrating around him. "Yeah, I think so too." And for the first time in a long while, Elias didn't feel torn between two worlds. He had found his place, not just in the wilderness, but in the heart of Pinarest. And as the firelight danced in the distance, he knew that no matter what the future held, he would never have to wander alone again. Summer arrived with a hush. The long days stretched lazily across the sky, and Pinarès flourished in the warmth of the sun. The town had taken on a life of its own, the once stagnant energy now vibrant, renewed. Elias and Eleanor's place within it had grown stronger. It had become a sanctuary, a place where both of them, once isolated in the world, had finally begun to weave themselves into the fabric of community. For the first time in years, it felt like they were part of something much bigger than themselves. Elias had grown comfortable here, more comfortable than he had ever thought possible. He still wandered the woods, still felt the deep call of the mountains, but there was no longer the sharp divide between the two. The townspeople had accepted him, not as an outsider, but as one of their own, someone who had a place in the world they had built together. But even as the town prospered, and Elias found a rhythm in his life, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to discover. The mountains were still there, just beyond the town's borders, as much a part of him as the town itself. They had always been there, silent and powerful, and Elias had the sense that there were pieces of himself still hidden in their shadows. One crisp morning, when the sun was just beginning to rise and the first light touched the peaks of the mountains, Elias decided it was time to return to the place where his journey had truly begun, the edge of the forest, where the wild things lived. He had spent enough time in Pinarest, enough time in the comfort of community, and now he needed to reconnect with the wild part of himself. Eleanor, as always, understood. She had seen the same need in him, had felt the same restlessness in herself. While she had come to terms with her place in the town, there were moments when she, too, felt the pull of the mountains. It was a connection that never quite left them, no matter how much they had changed. "I'll come with you," Eleanor said one evening as they prepared for the trek. She had always been his anchor, always by his side, but this time Elias could feel that she, too, was seeking something in the wilderness, a final peace. They packed lightly, only the essentials: food, water, a blanket to keep the chill of the night away. It wasn't a journey of survival, it was a journey of understanding, of honoring the past while embracing the future. Together, they would return to the mountains, to the wild. As they set off, the familiar path beneath their boots felt like an old friend, guiding them back to something that had always been there. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches stretching high, and the scent of pine and earth filled the air. The mountain's heartbeat pulsed in the distance, steady and unchanging. They walked for hours, the town disappearing behind them, the world narrowing to the sound of their footsteps and the call of distant birds. The further they went, the quieter the world became. It was as though the mountains were drawing them in, wrapping them in a stillness that felt both ancient and timeless. Eventually, they reached the clearing, a place where the wild was at its most raw and untamed. The wind here was stronger, the trees thicker, the air sharper. It was the place where Elias had first learned to survive, the place that had shaped him into the man he was. It was also the place where he had felt most alone, most disconnected from the world around him. But now, standing here with Eleanor beside him, Elias felt different.
The wild was no longer something to be feared or escaped, it was something to be embraced. The mountains had always been a part of him, and now they were a part of her too. They stood together side by side, and for the first time, Elias didn't feel like he was torn between two worlds. The wild and the town were one, woven together into the fabric of his life. Eleanor turned to him, her face soft but determined. "It's time, Elias," she said quietly. "We've both changed, but this part of us will always be here." Elias nodded, his gaze drifting over the landscape. "I know. I think I've always known." They spent the day in the clearing, the wind rustling the leaves, the scent of earth and pine filling their lungs. The silence between them was comfortable, not heavy, as if the land itself had become their conversation. As night fell, the stars filled the sky, more brilliant than Elias had ever remembered. They set up camp by a stream, the water murmuring softly as it passed over the rocks. Elias gazed up at the sky, the constellations familiar but still awe-inspiring. It felt like the world had opened up to him in a way it never had before. "I used to think I had to choose," Elias said, breaking the quiet. "Choose between the wild and the town, between the mountains and the people. But now, I realize, I don't have to choose. I belong to both." Eleanor smiled, the warmth of it reaching her eyes. "You always have, Elias, and so have I." They sat in silence for a while, the night deepening around them. There were no answers to find here, no grand revelations. But that was the point, Elias realized. Sometimes the journey wasn't about finding something, it was about returning to where you had always belonged, about seeing the truth of who you were all along. The following morning, they began the journey back to Pinarest. The town awaited them, as it always did, with its routines, its people, its steady pulse. But Elias knew now that he was more than just a boy raised by wolves. He was more than the town's healer, more than the son of Eleanor Blackwood. He was Elias, part of both worlds, two pieces of a whole that had always belonged together. And as they walked back toward the town, the mountains still standing tall behind them, Elias felt the pull of both places, but it was no longer a struggle. It was simply home.